Hi, if you were with me last time, you know about Dorian's backstory, about Kelso, the grandfather who had the lower class boyfriend of Dorian's mother murdered, took the mother and Dorian back home with him. The mother died a year later, and he brought up Dorian, this somber old man. We're about to go into chapter 4. You'll see there's a month gap between the previous events and this. And really, there's two women who come into the story here. One is Lord Henry's wife. I think this is the only time we meet her. And the other is Dorian's new love. Chapter 4. We need this month gap. It's got to give Dorian time to meet this girl and to develop a relationship with her. One afternoon, a month later, Dorian Gray was reclining in a luxurious armchair in the little library of Lord Henry's house in Mayfair. Lord Henry had not yet come in. He was always late on principle, his principle being that punctuality is the thief of time, as opposed, of course, to the proverb that procrastination is the thief of time. He's waiting and waiting. He thinks of going away, but at last he heard a step outside, and the door opened. "How late you are, Harry," he murmured. "I'm afraid it's not Harry, Mr. Gray," answered a shrill voice. He glanced round and rose to his feet. "I beg your pardon. You thought it was my husband." "It is only his wife. You must let me introduce myself. I know you quite well by your photographs. I think my husband has got 17 of them." "Not 17, Lady Henry." "Well, 18 then. And I saw you with him the other night at the opera." If I were her, I would run at this point. She laughed nervously as she spoke, and watched him with her vague forget-me-not eyes. She was a curious woman, whose dresses always looked as if they had been designed in a rage and put on in a tempest, in a storm. She was usually in love with somebody, and as her passion was never returned, she had kept all her illusions. She tried to look picturesque, but only succeeded in being untidy. Her name was Victoria, and she had a perfect mania for going to church. Dorian mentions the name of the opera that he was at when she saw him. It's a Wagner opera. She says, yes, it was that opera. I like Wagner's music better than anybody's. It is so loud that one can talk the whole time without other people hearing what one says. It's a joke about Wagner's music because some of his music is very loud. Dorian disagrees. "I'm afraid I don't think so, Lady Henry. I never talk during music, at least during good music. If one hears bad music, it is one's duty to drown it in conversation." And that sounds just like the sort of thing that Lord Henry would say. And that's what she picks up. "Ah, that's one of Harry's views, isn't it, Mr. Gray? I always hear Harry's views from his friends. It is the only way I get to know of them. But you must not think I don't like good music. I adore it, but I'm afraid of it. It makes me too romantic. I have simply worshipped pianists, 2 at a time sometimes, Harry tells me. I don't know what it is about them. Perhaps it is that they are foreigners. They all are, aren't they? Even those that are born in England become foreigners after a time, don't they? It's so clever of them, and such a compliment to art. Makes it quite cosmopolitan or worldly, doesn't it? It's a joke. But here's Harry. Harry, I came in to look for you, to ask you something. I forget what it was, and I found Mr. Gray here." Lord Henry says, "So sorry I'm late, Dorian. I went to look after a piece of old brocade, a piece of material, in Wardour Street, and had to bargain for hours for it. Nowadays, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing." Another Oscar Wilde paradox through Lord Henry. So the wife leaves, and Henry warns Dorian, "Never marry a woman with straw-coloured hair, Dorian." "Why, Harry?" "Because they're so sentimental." "But I like sentimental people." "Never marry at all, Dorian. Men marry because they're tired, women because they're curious. Both are disappointed." "I don't think I'm likely to marry, Harry. I'm too much in love." "Who are you in love with?" "With an actress," said Dorian Gray, blushing. That's a rather commonplace debut. That's a rather ordinary kind of person to be making your entrance into society with. You would not say so if you saw her, Harry. Who is she? Her name is Sybil Vane. Never heard of her. No one has. People will some day, however. She's a genius. My dear boy, no woman is a genius. Women are a decorative sex. They never have anything to say, but they say it charmingly. Perhaps some misogynistic anti-woman comments coming in through Lord Henry, who asks, how long have you known her? About 3 weeks. And where did you come across her? I'll tell you, Harry, but you mustn't be unsympathetic about it. After all, it never would have happened if I had not met you. You filled me with a wild desire to know everything about life. I used to look at everyone who passed me and wonder with a sort of mad curiosity what sort of lives they led. Some of them fascinated me. Others filled me with terror. There was an exquisite poison in the air. I had a passion for sensations. I felt that this grey, monstrous London of ours, with its myriads of people, its sordid sinners, and its splendid sins, as you once phrased it, must have something in store for me. About 8:30, I passed by an absurd little theatre with great flaring gas jets and gaudy playbills, gaudily colourful posters. A hideous Jew, and he's very anti-Semitic in his comments here, anti-Jewish, perhaps showing prejudice back in Victorian London. A hideous Jew in the most amazing waistcoat I ever beheld or saw in my life was standing at the entrance smoking a vile cigar. He had greasy ringlets of hair, and an enormous diamond blazed in the centre of a soiled or dirty shirt. Have a box, my lord, he said, a box. Those square things up in the wall on the side of the theatre. I should have put a picture of a box in here. Anyway, it's a private seating in the theatre. Have a box, my lord, he said. You'll laugh at me, I know, but I really went in and paid a whole guinea for the stage box. To the present day, I can't make out why I did so. And yet if I hadn't, my dear Harry, if I hadn't, I should have missed the greatest romance of my life. I see you laughing. It's horrid of you. I'm not laughing, Dorian. At least I'm not laughing at you. But you should not say the greatest romance of your life. You should say the first romance of your life. You will always be loved, and you will always be in love with love. There are exquisite things in store for you. This is merely the beginning. Dorian's describing he's describing the atmosphere in the theatre before the show. Women went about with oranges and ginger beer, and there was a terrible consumption of nuts going on. The play, it was Romeo and Juliet. I must admit that I was rather annoyed at the idea of seeing Shakespeare done in such a wretched hole of a place. Romeo was a stout, he's overweight and too old, elderly gentleman, with corked eyebrows, a husky tragedy voice, and a figure like a beer barrel. Mercutio was almost as bad. They were both as grotesque or ugly and weird and awful as the scenery, and that looked as if it had come out of a country booth. But Juliet... Harry, imagine a girl hardly 17 years of age, with a little flower-like face, a small Greek head with plaited coils of dark brown hair, eyes that were violet wells of passion, lips that were like the petals of a rose. She was the loveliest thing I'd ever seen in my life. And her voice. I never heard such a voice. It was very low at first, with deep, mellow notes that seemed to fall singly upon one's ear. Your voice and the voice of Sybil Vane are two things that I shall never forget. Harry, I do love her. She's everything to me in life. Night after night I go to see her play. One evening she's Rosalind, and the next evening she's Imogen. I've seen her die in the gloom of an Italian tomb, sucking the poison from her lover's lips. ordinary women never appeal to one's imagination. They are limited to their century. No glamour ever transfigures them. They have their stereotyped smile and their fashionable manner. They are quite obvious. But an actress, how different an actress is, Harry. Why didn't you tell me that the only thing worth loving is an actress? Because I've loved so many of them, Dorian. Dorian says, if I ever did a crime, I would come and confess it to you, which he does not later on in the novel. You would understand me. People like you, the willful sunbeams of life, don't commit crimes, Dorian. And we won't understand this unless we see the previous question, which was Lord Henry saying, what are your actual relations with Sybil Vane implying? Have you had physical relations with her? And Dorian Gray leaps to his feet with flushed cheeks, burning eyes. Harry, Sybil Vane is sacred. It is only the sacred things that are worth touching, Dorian, said Lord Henry, with a strange touch of pathos in his voice. Why should you be annoyed? I suppose she will belong to you some day. When one is in love, one always begins by deceiving oneself, and one always ends by deceiving others, which is a rather cynical view of love from Lord Henry. That is what the world calls a romance. He describes how he met her the first time he was introduced by the Jewish theatre owner. He was a most offensive brute, though he had an extraordinary passion for Shakespeare. He told me once, with an air of pride, that his 5 bankruptcies were entirely due to the bard, the poet, Shakespeare, as he insisted on calling him. He seemed to think it a distinction. Harry says it was a distinction. Most people become bankrupt through having invested too heavily in the prose of life, the unpoetical parts of life. To have ruined oneself over poetry is an honor. But when did you first speak to Miss Sybil Vane? Is this the 3rd night? She was so shy and so gentle. There's something of a child about her. Her eyes opened wide in exquisite wonder when I told her what I thought of her performance, and she seemed quite unconscious of her power. She said quite simply to me, you look more like a prince. I must call you Prince Charming, and she doesn't know his name. She calls him Prince Charming. Dorian says, you don't understand her, Harry. She regarded me merely as a person in a play. She knows nothing of life. She lives with her mother, a faded, tired woman who played Lady Capulet, Juliet's mother, in a sort of magenta dressing wrapper on the first night, and looks as if she had seen better days. Dorian says, Sybil is the only thing I care about. What is it to me where she came from? From her little head to her little feet. She is absolutely and entirely divine. Every night of my life I go to see her act. Every night she is more marvelous. Harry says, you can't dine with me tonight, Dorian, can't you? He shook his head. Tonight she is Imogen, and tomorrow night she will be Juliet. When is she Sybil Vane? Never. I congratulate you. How horrid you are. She is all the great heroines of the world in one. She is more than an individual. You laugh, but I tell you she has genius. I love her, and I must make her love me. You, who know all the secrets of life, tell me how to charm Sybil Vane to love me. I want to make Romeo jealous. I want the dead lovers of the world to hear our laughter and grow sad. I want a breath of our passion to stir their dust into consciousness, to wake their ashes into pain. My God, Harry, how I worship her. He was walking up and down the room as he spoke. Hectic spots of red burned on his cheeks. He was terribly excited. Lord Henry watched him with a subtle sense of pleasure. How different he was now from the shy, frightened boy he had met in Basil Hallward's studio. His nature had developed like a flower, had borne blossoms of scarlet flame. Out of its secret hiding place had crept his soul, and desire had come to meet it on the way. And what do you propose to do? I want you and Basil to come with me some night and see her act. I have not the slightest fear of the result. You are certain to acknowledge her genius. Then we must get her out of the Jew's hands. She is bound to him for 3 years, at least for 2 years and 8 months from the present time. I shall have to pay him something, of course. When all that is settled, I shall take a West End theatre, a London theatre, and bring her out into society properly. She will make the world as mad as she has made me. Deciding which day to go, how about tomorrow? She plays Juliet tomorrow. Lord Henry, all right, the Bristol at 8 o'clock, and I'll get Basil. Not 8, Harry, please. 6:30. We must be there before the curtain rises. You must see her in the first act where she meets Romeo. Harry says it must be 7. No gentleman dines before 7. Dorian says, Dear Basil, I've not laid eyes on him for a week. I'm thinking, poor Basil. It's rather horrid of me, as he sent me my portrait in the most wonderful frame, specially designed by himself. And, though I am a little jealous of the picture for being a whole month younger than I am, I must admit that I delight in it. Perhaps you'd better write to him. I don't want to see him alone. He says things that annoy me. He gives me good advice. Lord Henry says, people are very fond of giving away what they need most themselves. They speak about Basil here a bit. Maybe I was just feeling sorry for Basil that I skipped it. Lord Henry is thinking. Certainly few people had ever interested him as much as Dorian Gray, and yet the lad's mad adoration of someone else caused him not the slightest pang of annoyance or jealousy. He was pleased by it. It made him a more interesting study. And these last words in the chapter really about Lord Henry's psychological ambitions. Seems he's using Dorian as the subject of a psychological experiment. So, but it says where he started by taking himself apart, and so he had begun by vivisecting himself, as he had ended by vivisecting others. Human life, that appeared to him the one thing worth investigating. It was true that as one watched life in its curious crucible of pain and pleasure, one could not wear over one's face a mask of glass, nor keep the sulphurous fumes from troubling the brain and making the imagination turbid with monstrous fancies and misshapen dreams. They were poisons so subtle that to know their properties one had to sicken of them. They were maladies or illnesses so strange that one had to pass through them if one sought to understand their nature. Sensation. One could never pay too high a price for any sensation. He was conscious, and the thought brought a gleam of pleasure into his brown agate eyes, that it was through certain words of his, musical words said with musical utterance, that Dorian Gray's soul had turned to this white girl and bowed in worship before her. To a large extent, the lad was his own creation. Yes, the lad was premature. The boy. He was gathering his harvest while it was yet spring. The pulse and passion of youth were in him, but he was becoming self-conscious. It was delightful to watch him. With his beautiful face and his beautiful soul, he was a thing to wonder at. It was no matter how it all ended or was destined to end. He was like one of those gracious figures in a pageant or a play, whose joys seem to be remote from one, but whose sorrows stir one's sense of beauty, and whose wounds are like red roses. He began to wonder whether we could ever make psychology so absolute a science that each little spring of life would be revealed to us. It was clear to him that the experimental method was the only method by which one could arrive at any scientific analysis of the passions, and certainly Dorian Gray was a subject made to his hand, and seemed to promise rich and fruitful results. He thought of his friend's young fiery-coloured life, and wondered how it was all going to end. When he arrived home, about 12:30, he saw a telegram lying on the hall table. He opened it and found it was from Dorian Gray. It was to tell him that he was engaged to be married to Sybil Vane. That's chapter 4. As a quick summary, Dorian meets Victoria, Lord Henry's wife. He tells her about Sybil. Mr. Isaacs is the Jewish guy who runs the theatre. Dorian promises to free her, get her a job in the West End. Infatuated with her because she plays all these different people. Arranged to go to the theatre tomorrow, and a telegram from Lord Henry. So we've up to now he's kind of been in the background, but from here he's the focus of the novel, more about the influence of Lord Henry, saying the sorts of things that Lord Henry says. And yeah, he hardly knows her, but yeah, they're engaged to be married at the end of the chapter. So that is chapter 4. The plot thickens. Look forward to seeing you in chapter 5. I'll try and put a picture of a theatre box in the thumbnail for this video. I'm wishing you a happy day. Join me again soon and subscribe, please.